Is my mic? Hello? Hi. Hi. How are you? Who's great? Who said that? Thank you. My name's Reggie Wilson. I'm artistic director of Reggie Wilson Fist, like this thing, and Heel, like that thing performance group, a Brooklyn, New York-based dance performance group. We do contemporary dance performance stuff. And a little nervous and a little hot, so. There's sometimes some text in the work, a lot of times no text in the work. We do vocalizations also as part of the work. What to tell you? I am originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you. I don't know how to make you excited. There's a lot of German folks that immigrated to Milwaukee. Still nothing. Beer. Who said Packers? Yes. My family is on my mother's side, as far back as we can trace, to the early to mid 1800s, are from Moscow, Tennessee. Moscow, Tennessee. And, huh? Frank, who? Me? No. No. They really came from Moscow, Tennessee. Huh? Memphis. Yes. Right. And and you know Poplar Grove, Arkansas? Marvel, Arkansas? Yes, that's where they're actually from. And on my, what do you call it? My father's side, they are from Grenada, and that is Grenada, Mississippi. Right. And that's also to the early to mid 1800s. So as far back as we've been able to trace, my family roots are in the Mississippi Delta. And they moved up during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, moved up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I left Milwaukee as soon as possible at around age 17 to move to New York City to go to New York University. Graduated from there in 1988 and studied with a lot of folks there. They brought a lot of choreographers in, Bill T. Jones, David Gordon, Twyla Tharp, blah, 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 on and on. Studied composition with a woman named Phyllis Lamhut, who was an original member of the Alvin Nikolai dance company. Yay! And what else? I danced after I graduated with a New York, at the time, New York-based choreographer named Ohad Naharan, who left New York to go back home. I was supposed to go back home with him to Israel to dance, but I had a knee injury, so my dance career kind of stopped. I'd been choreographing from high school into college, and so after the knee injury and not moving to Israel, I really started going back into trying to get my own choreography up and out. And even at NYU, I was really interested because before I got to NYU, I really didn't know what postmodern dance was. Once I got to NYU, I started really understanding and hearing about all these postmodern ideas and what was going on at the Judson Dance Theater and all these crazy, wacky ideas. And I wanted to know what those ideas relationship could be to African culture, to African American culture and the African diaspora. I'd always been fascinated by what my image of Africa was from watching documentaries and studying some courses in ethnography and anthropology at school. And after, you know, the whole knee injury trauma, desperately wanted to go to Africa, but I figured before I went to Africa, where I was going to be begging, borrowing, and stealing everything I laid my eyes on, I thought it might not be a bad idea to actually go back and find out what, if any, African retentions had actually been passed down through the ages, whether my family had come from which different parts of Africa or the Caribbean or whichever parts of the globe. And so I went back to the church that I grew up in Milwaukee, Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church. Grew up Baptist, grew up going to church every Sunday, falling asleep in church every Sunday. And I went back and wanted to find out what some of the songs that I had fallen asleep through were, what the actual words were. A lot of times they were moaning songs and not singing songs, but sometimes at the beginning of the service, the deacons would come forward at the front of the church and face forward, and one of them would line out a hymn, singing one of these old long-metered songs. I love the Lord, He heard my cry. He heard my cry and pitied every moan. And you don't know that one. And that would go on and on and on and on and on. And I would sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep. And I also used to, and I asked actually about that moaning. I asked my aunt, and she said that what she understood one of the reasons why the old folks moaned, or why you would moan in church, is so that the devil wouldn't understand what you were saying. But that you would be able to have a direct communication with Spirit, with God yourself. And this seemed, okay, this is mystical, this is spiritual, maybe that's connected to Africa. And I got excited about that. But the church services that I grew up in were really different than my white friends at school's churches. And people would get what we used to call get happy, which means almost get into a trance state. Music was really lively. At some points, people would jump and run up and down the aisle. Miss Olmsted would always go to the wall and start pounding. Sister Mayweather would almost do like a backflip over the pew in front of us, and we'd try and catch her. It was a very active service. So I thought that maybe that also had something to do with our African ancestry. And I really kept going, wanting to find out more about this, what was the African retentions that had been passed on in African American culture. And people were pretty closed-mouthed about what might be African or what might not be African and what they did. So I went back down south to where my family was from to start interviewing people, going to more church services, going to choir rehearsals, going to prayer meetings, going to Sunday school services, going to funerals, going to weddings, going to more funerals. And people were still not really free talking about these things that they had practiced that might be seen as backward, as African, as superstition. But these were the things that I was searching for to kind of piece together any relationship I might have inherited from Africa. And went down south, kept looking for things that maybe my grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents could have practiced in combining African traditions with Protestant Christianity. I was also just really trying to look back and look back and look back and look back, and went to a lecture with this woman, Cheryl Byron, who's no longer with us, but she had a company in Brooklyn. I went to a lecture, and she was talking about the spiritual Baptists of Trinidad and Tobago. And spiritual Baptists are also Christian, Protestant Christian folks, but they maintain even more African tradition within their worship style. And one of the things she told me that they did, they had this breathing thing that they do to kind of move into a trance state. I was like, okay, I'm going to Trinidad. And got to Trinidad, started going to church and working with the spiritual Baptists and trying to understand what the spiritual Baptist faith was about. And in order to become part of the spiritual Baptist faith, just like almost any Christian faith, you have to be baptized. And to be baptized for the spiritual Baptist, you can't just be baptized with a little sprinkle of water in your head like some of us. You can't be baptized, as I was, in a baptismal pool in the front of the church. You have to be baptized in what they call living water. Now, living water is defined as any naturally occurring body of water. It could be a pond, a stream, but ideally, if you can find a place where the water flows into the ocean, it's a place of natural cleansing, a place to be baptized, a place to be transformed. Now, for the spiritual Baptists of Trinidad and Tobago, after you've been baptized, you want to know what your role in the community is supposed to be. Now, you do that through a process they call moaning. Now, their moaning is what I would call almost an initiation. And you go into seclusion in the church, and you fast, pray, fast, pray, fast, pray, fast, pray, bim. Now, you're not fully in seclusion. Members of the Spiritual Baptist community come to pray with you, to start helping you with something they call adoption. Now, adoption is aspirated, rhythmical breathing that they use to travel spiritually to the high. Because what your role in the community is supposed to be is not given to you by man. It's given to you by spirit. So you fast and pray. But you're assigned what they call a nurse. Now, she's there to look after you and help you with your bodily needs. Maybe give you a little tap of water in your tongue. But one of her roles is to help you learn this adoption. And they start you off just as if you were in school, in university, maybe even in kindergarten. They start you off at the beginning. Hey, 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 bim. Now, after you finish that level, they take you to the next level. B, 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 bim. Now, after you keep going to deeper depths and higher heights, you start traveling to places that you know, that you've read about in the Bible. You might be traveling along and meet the woman at the well. Or you might be traveling along and meet Ezekiel in the valley of the dry bones. And then you start traveling to places that you know in the physical world. You might travel to England or France to work in a nunnery or a monastery, to work with the Catholic saints. Or you might travel to China to work with the Buddha. Traveling. Now, the spiritual Baptists like to travel spiritually. Now, one of the first spiritual Baptist services that I went to was a baptismal service. And the baptismal candidates were lined up in the front of the sanctuary. And they were lined up and they called them by their names, by their numbers and not by their names. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., up to 7 they had at this service. Now, candidate number 1 was starting to travel spiritually, but nobody could tell where she was traveling to. And everybody started pulling her because nobody likes to travel alone. Everyone wants a spiritual companion. But nobody could tell where she was traveling to, except in the back of the church. There was a mother of the church, and she was known as a seer, not a pointer or a diver, because she could see where people were traveling to, and she could see where candidate number 1 was traveling. So from the back of the church, this mother raised the hymn. And the entire congregation picked it up. She could tell that candidate number 1 was traveling to India. Now, it might have been because it was my first time in a spiritual Baptist church, but I could swear that the entire congregation had been lifted up and we were placed in the hull of a ship. And we were traveling to India. Now, it's also my understanding that the spiritual Baptists of Trinidad and Tobago have at least 2 concepts of Africa, and they like to travel to Africa. Now, you can travel to work with the Orisha of Yoruba land, which is present-day Nigeria. Or you can travel to a place of deep, dark secrets and mysteries, the Congo. started off by telling you about Reggie Wilson, Fist and Heel performance group. In 1996, Fist and Heel had its first opportunity to travel to Africa. We were starting to work on a collaboration with a performance group there named Black Mfolosi. So we'd left New York, flown to London, then down to Johannesburg, and then up to Harare, and then down to Bulawayo. And we got to where we were going, they met us, took us to the hotel, we got a good night's rest. And then the next day we made it to rehearsal. And we made introduction to the group. And I was more than excited to find out many of the members of Black Mfolosi either had been or still were members of the Zionist Church. And I was even more excited to find out that they also had a rhythmical, aspirated breathing that they used to travel spiritually. So I'd been traveling in the physical world, all the way from those preachers from down south, all the way down to the Caribbean, all the way back to Africa. Breathing, traveling, traveling, and breathing, breathing, traveling, breathing, traveling. Bim. Thank you.
I know some folks have to leave. Probably some other folks are going to come in. So while Reggie is catching his breath, I want to talk about how I came to know his work and to work with him as a dramaturg. I'm Susan Manning, and those of you in the audience who know my scholarship likely know my first book titled Ecstasy and the Demon, which was a narrative of the career of Mary Wigman that highlighted her very complex accommodation with the National Socialists. Should I be waiting until a few more people get seated and such? I'm sorry, I feel like I jumped the gun there. Are folks coming in? Come on in and sit down, and then I'll kind of start my introduction. Folks still coming in? When the last person comes in, I mean, just close the door behind you, not that it has to lock or anything. Okay, I'm going to start this intro again. Okay, blah, blah, blah. I'm Susan Manning. If you know me, you probably know Ecstasy and the Demon, and that book was about that very complex accommodation between Mary Wigman and the National Socialists. And actually, my interest in German culture at that time really came from my own family history. For my father was a Jewish-German emigre. But after publishing that book, I decided it was really time to turn my critical attention to dance and politics in my own country during that same mid-century period. And so my second book really looked at how a number of choreographers really kind of negotiated the shift from the Red Decade, when the Communist Party was legal in the US, the 30s, to the Red Scare and McCarthyism, when members of the Communist Party had to, name names or take the Fifth Amendment. And in that book, I really started looking at relationships between black and white choreographers in that mid-century period. And I was very inspired to write that book by seeing the work of Bill T. Jones and other black postmodernists in the US, because their way of kind of deconstructing the category of black dance that had emerged in the black arts movements of the 60s really made me want to go back and ask different questions about the history of American dance. When I came of age in the 70s, first started in the field, and there were this like one set of books called Black Dance on one shelf, and then there was this other set of books called Mainstream Modern Dance on the other shelf, but really that was like white modern dance, and so I wanted to kind of intervene in that history. So what really interested me, hi Reggie, I'll be real quick now. So what really interested me is after Modern Dance, Negro Dance, Race and Motion was published, I was just really interested in how many of my American colleagues assumed that now my research focus had turned from German dance under the Nazis to black dance. And whereas my intention was to write this integrated history of American modern dance. And I realized then that my experience, to some extent, paralleled the experience of some of the choreographers I was writing about, like Catherine Dunham or Pearl Primus or others, who really saw themselves as making a contribution to an American dance, but then got kind of bracketed into this black dance category. So around that time, I first saw Reggie's work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. I saw the work he was referring to, Black Burlesque Revisited, which had come about from a long collaboration with not only Black Mfulsi in Zimbabwe, but also with Noble Douglas Dance Company in Trinidad and Tobago, a modern dance troupe. And what really sort of just so blew my mind, to use the vernacular, in 2003, was how Reggie's work, what was Africanist and what was postmodernist, was in just this, I now say the two just vibrated, and I love that. I would look at, that's a postmodernist device. No, that's an Africanist device. Oh, that's postmodernist device. So Reggie's work really made me question what those categories were and what they meant. Then a couple years later, I saw Introduction, and I think what's so fascinating here, again, I think you've now experienced what I experienced in terms of this double frame, right, of the Africanist quality and the postmodernist quality. And when I think of Introduction, I think of the genre that's become so popular in Europe, not yet in the US, called the lecture performance, right? And as a matter of fact, Holgar before said, so should I introduce this as a lecture performance? I said, well, that's what it is, but that's not like an American genre that we use. So that's one of those kind of interesting intersections. Last thing I want to say is that when I saw all of Reggie's work when he was in Chicago, kept in touch, and then 2 years ago, summer of 2011, he asked me to serve as a dramaturg on his new work called Moses's. And this is, I have to say, this is the very first time I've ever collaborated on a professional dance production. And the role of a dramaturg is not one that I trained for or even one that I aspired to, but it came very much as a gift, an invitation that I really couldn't turn down, and this extraordinary opportunity to support and to learn about an artist whose work I find so deeply compelling and beautiful. My day job remains, as it has for 25 years, to develop Tanzwissenschaft, dance studies, within the contents of Theaterwissenschaft and the Geisteswissenschaften within theater and performance studies in the humanities. So I think maybe now we can turn over, or you want me to make one more point? Sure. Truly? Yes. Okay. So I have to say that just every dimension of this process has been a real revelation for me. But I think above all, what fascinates me is how both Reggie and I, as the children of migrants, my father from Germany, Reggie's parents from the American South, were both fascinated, one might even say obsessed, with how history shapes our present realities and even the histories that we've not experienced ourselves firsthand. So with that, Reggie, I'm going to let you pick up the story about how you decided to work with a dramaturg on Moses's. And just so folks know, the premiere of the piece will be in Philadelphia in September. The work will be at the Brooklyn Academy of Music at the Next Wave Festival in early December, and we have a few brochures there if anyone will be in Philadelphia in September or New York in December.
Yeah. How y'all doing? You still good? So this piece, Moses's, as not possessive, but as in more than one Moses, kind of presented itself to me. I was invited by the Foundation for Jewish Culture by a woman named Elise Bernhardt, who had worked with me and presented me at some other organizations and stuff in New York. She was setting up a kind of open-ended residency in Jerusalem and was looking for artists of different disciplines to come and kind of do a pilot version of the residency. And I had just finished a large project and didn't have any new ideas, and this was a really open-ended kind of invitation to come and do something which, for a lot of artists in the States, I don't think happens very often. And so I was really excited to go because, like I talked about a little bit in introduction, I have this peculiar relationship with Israel and working with Ohad, so I was excited to kind of go back and reconnect with him and find out what this Gaga thing that he had been developing was supposed to be about. And I had been to Israel a couple of times. I was a little nervous about going back for a number of different reasons. And for my own kind of political stance of some things that had happened when I had gone to places in Africa and gotten caught up in over-associating, in my opinion, myself with the friends and or family that I was connecting with and taking up their politics about their side of the battle or the war, whatever was going on. And I said, well, I really want to go back to Israel, but then this book by Zora Neale Hurston kind of fell off the shelf called Moses, Man of the Mountain. So I took that with me, and I told a dancer in my company, Anna, that I was reading this book and I was going to Israel, and she got really excited. She's like, oh, well, my uncle is in Jerusalem, and he's a professor, and he's a Moses scholar, and you're reading this Moses book, and you should meet him. And I said, okay, I'll have time, I'll meet him. And met him, and he started talking about how this Moses story, this Moses figure, how it's kind of this ongoing human story that gets recreated over time, whether it was Hammurabi, whether it was Moses, whether it was Jesus, whether it was Martin Luther King, this idea of leadership and pulling people out of a negative situation. And that kind of got interesting, and he said, show me your Moses, and I'll tell you who you are. And that was kind of intriguing. I said, okay, let's try and put this to the test. And met with a bunch of Israeli choreographers, and for me it did seem like there was kind of a connection between what part of the Moses story they either remembered or cared about. A lot of them didn't care at all about Moses or the Moses story. And, but it seemed like there was a real connection between that part of the story and some mirror of their life. I'm not going to go into all the details about that, but then I went to Egypt after that and got really inspired by thinking about black folks and whether Egypt is considered part of Africa. It's not. Is it part of Arabia? Is it part of the Levant? And then its connection to the Moses story, of course. Then went to Turkey, and so all of these things about antiquity and monotheism and civilization started coming up, and I started thinking about the relationship of black folks and Africa to these ancient civilizations, and the relationship of ancient Egypt to ancient Nubia and to the rest of Africa. And then I finally convinced myself, because I think the Israel trip was in 2010. Yeah. And by 2011, it had definitely started forming in my head that this was going to be a project and I needed to figure this stuff out. I was very fascinated about Moses. I was very fascinated about Zora Neale Hurston, this African-American female writer during the Harlem Renaissance. I was very fascinated about the relationship of ancient Egypt to ancient Nubia. a lot of things, and I'd also been starting to hear in the States, and people were talking about dramaturgy, and I was trying to figure out, well, am I doing my own dramaturgy? What is dramaturgy? Do I need, it's my research, and maybe this is a lot of stuff I'm dealing with. It wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of have somebody come along and help me out. And Susan and I had developed a relationship by then, and that's when I asked you on board.
Yeah, yeah. You want me to pick up the story from there?
Please.
So what was funny is when we first started working 2 summers ago, Reggie was really kind of obsessed with like, what is a dramaturg? And he would go online and, you know, try to find a definition. Now, I was so happy to be working with Reggie. I didn't care what a dramaturg was, you know, this just was so much fun to me. But, you know, so we did spend a little bit of time trying to, you know, suss that out. Though, as it's developed, I have to say I've had 3 roles as a dramaturg. The first year or so, I was working very much as a research assistant for Reggie. He was posing research questions. I was going and gathering a lot of material, bringing it back. He was then selecting what interested him. Then I was sort of putting that all on a research website and writing kind of introductory memos for that material, which is now open just to the, at this point, just to the collaborators on the project. I've also been something of a sounding board. I live in Chicago. Reggie lives in Brooklyn, but every couple weeks we have a long conversation about, you know, what's happening with the project. And then I'm also working really to document the project, and I'm going to publish a kind of cluster of articles in TDR, a Journal of Performance Studies. So I myself now, having been a historian for all these years, I'm really working as an ethnographer in many ways. So I guess I wanted to just give a brief little description of some of the research I did, and then you can pick it up from there. And so, again, Reggie was asking these really, you know, he had these big, you know, and what seemed at first really different research interests. Okay, Zora Neale Hurston, who's been canonized as, you know, a leading African-American writer in the US in the 20th century. Ohad Naharin, who we all know has now been canonized as a leading Israeli modern dancer and choreographer. Zar, which is a possession ritual quite widespread in the Middle East and in North Africa. And when Reggie was on that trip to Egypt, he'd heard some Zar music, so wanted me to find out something about that. And then Nubian culture as well, as he's described. So what to me was so fascinating was finding these very surprising interconnections between 4 research topics, which seemed so disparate when I began. So I wanted to just give you a quick little, does this make sense? A quick little,
yeah,
what was sort of interesting about those interconnections. So Zora Neale Hurston, you know, and Reggie in a way, you know, sees her as an artist who, before Reggie, worked as both a folklorist, an ethnographer, and a choreographer. She was also a writer. And we were interested in her relationship with Melville Herskovits, a very well-known anthropologist who sort of started, very much a pioneer in African studies in the US Academy, and who happened to have taught where I teach at Northwestern, and so we really have all his correspondence. So we could even go and read his correspondence with Zora Neale Hurston. He also was a mentor to Katherine Dunham, so that was also another interesting point. And it turned out that actually Zora Neale Hurston was a few years older than Melville Herskovits, and yet, you know, he clearly saw himself as the teacher and the mentor, and she as the student, but she was also gathering all this incredibly valuable material in Florida and the Bahamas, which he then also quoted in his book. So to what extent, you know, did the informant, you know, Zora Neale Hurston become kind of the teacher of her teacher? And so those kinds of relationships between leader and follower became something, a really important thread through the work. And then something really similar in a way with Ohad Naharin. And when I was looking at, you know, what was Ohad doing in the 80s, where, you know, he was considered a rising choreographer in New York, but one of many, right, not the star that he is now. And just Reggie sort of looking back at his work and thinking, you know, how much Ohad had influenced Reggie, but maybe there was something about Reggie's movement style. He was one of the dancers who had originated that piece that we now know as Arms. You know, maybe that had gone both ways. I mean, so that, you know, just questioning that kind of relationship between mentor and disciple, I guess, in the dance world as well. Zar was utterly fascinating, and here you know, as I said, it's a fairly widespread possession ritual. Here there was, you know, 180 years of Western observation of czar, from missionaries in the 1830s to sort of diplomats in the 1860s, and then you could track the last 100+ years of anthropology by all the different types of anthropological approaches. So again, this is kind of contextualizing what Zora Neale Hurston had been doing as an ethnographer, what Herskovits had been doing as an ethnographer. I got particularly interested in Michel Léry, who most likely saw La Création de le Monde in 1923, got very interested in surrealist poetry in Paris, in black music and dance, Josephine Baker and others, went on the big expedition in the early 30s from Dakar to Djibouti, which collected, 5,000 objects, came back, started the Museum of Man in Paris. He also was a really very interested in czar and left some very fascinating accounts of that. And then Nubia, again, a very interesting, what the present day southern Egypt and northern Sudan, but an ancient culture which was both a rival to Egypt, and at one point in the 25th dynasty, the Nubian kings had ruled Egypt, the so-called Black Pharaohs. So again, this was this fascinating question of how do we find out something about a culture where really most of the reports are from a rival culture or a culture that ultimately kind of conquered the earlier culture. So that was an interesting thought for us as well. And just something as simple as the fact that the temple at Dendur at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which to us has always been, that's the great Egyptian temple, to realize that was actually a Nubian temple that was moved before the flooding with the Aswan Dam, and where so many of the Nubian monuments, you know, if they weren't moved out, were disappeared forever. So that just gives you a little sense of the kind of research that I was helping Reggie do. And you want to talk about fractals?
So it was a lot of different ideas that were interesting me and still in my head seemed connected to Moses. But at the same time, another book that kind of made itself apparent to me was this book called African Fractals by Ron Eglish. And it's looking at fractal symmetry and its relationship to African material culture, material stuff that people build and things. And I was started to wonder if it was so prevalent in so many different African contexts, and it was a conscious organizing device, that it probably was being used or would be visible in the performative culture. Maybe some of the things that I'd been fascinated by, obsessed with in African performance culture might be related. So started to do a little bit more investigation about that. Susan found a mathematician, which is good to have one of those, to talk through some of these things and to start developing material, thinking about what is fractal symmetry and what's the relationship between the material that I've already produced in my life, the dances that I've learned from different parts of Africa, and is there some way that all of these ideas as complex systems and complex ways of being, maybe thinking about fractal symmetry, or at least learning more about it, might help me organize this stuff. Yeah. So, and I think one or
yeah, that makes sense. And just, I mean, I don't want, you know, of course, I also want to watch the video as well, but just to say that as Reggie went into the studio and started generating material, you know, there was, you know, some material from OHAD. There was some research trips with the dancers. They came for a research residency in Chicago. They went to the Oriental Institute, so-called, and came back and were playing with sort of the statue poses. That's a section now called Pharaohs. So there were ways that this research then became, in a sense, sort of source material, found material that Reggie then used to generate material. But a lot of what you're seeing, and we won't explain all the fractals and what you're seeing, but in the studio, these really complex but simple fractal symmetries became really, really important devices for moving from those kind of found materials, the found movement, into you know, the material, and now Reggie, I think, has a great way helps me understand the difference between when he generates material in the studio versus choreographing the material, and now really is in the throes of having spent a year generating material, now really structuring it into the 75-minute piece. I guess there's one last, we're really going to have time for questions, thank goodness. There's just one last issue we wanted to raise, and I guess this is something that is just, to me, endlessly fascinating about Reggie's work, and sometimes, I guess, frustrating, how different spectators see the work so differently. And about a year ago in the spring, Reggie was revisiting some of his earlier choreographic work, and this was sort of part of the process of moving toward the Moses' project. And it was a work that was just staged in New York called The Revisitation, as he was revisiting this work. And so it would be fascinating to me that, you know, one section, actually Anna, the dancer who you see right there, her mother, who's a painter, came and saw the piece and go, it's minimal, you're doing danced minimalism. So she was looking from the view of postmodern art. And then another, you know, acquaintance of the company who had grown up in Haiti, or his family had immigrated from Haiti, saw the same concert and goes, oh my God, this is, you know, this is the world of my Haitian grandparents, right? So there's just this fascinatingly wide range. Of course, I come to it from this fascination in postmodern dance and how it makes us rethink modern dance. So I'm always, as I said earlier, tracking this vibration between postmodernism and you know, Africanist elements. And I guess I just, you know, wanted to link this back into the larger themes of the conference. And a lot of us yesterday, of course, were really kind of working through Jean-Luc Nancy's, you know, his view of kind of the relation between African culture and European culture, where he seemed to make such a divide, whereas Fulsten was trying to say that these cultures were always, in his mind, sort of interlinked, and he was trying to kind of understand that linkage maybe differently. And I guess I just want to kind of say that there's this sort of interesting analogy between some of the really broad responses you've had to your work and what we were all like, oh my God, there's such a gap here in understanding. I think you have been in that position as choreographer probably, you know, more than once. I don't know if you want to speak more to these questions of reception before we open up for questions.
I mean, not overly. I don't know if people have responses or questions from either kind of section or the piece, but it's always really kind of frustrating. Time and time again, I've been working in New York since 1989 professionally, and it never ceases to amaze me how people bring their baggage to a piece, and how so much of that baggage, when they're looking at the work of a black choreographer, or when they're looking at black bodies in the space, what they kind of, either their ignorance, their stereotypes, their racism, what they lay on top of the choreography, which may or may not actually be being dealt with in the choreography. And it's fascinating how hard it is to try and escape that. And for my white colleagues in the States, it's always been a conversation when they do finally use a black dancer or two or three. All of a sudden they look and they're like, oh my God, I can't dress them like that, they'll look like slaves. Oh my God, if they dress them like that. So these things get laid on to these bodies that have absolutely no relationship to the content of the choreography. So on that note, I don't know if we can open it up for, if people had some comments or questions or.
I just want to say I would like you to continue talking about what you were talking about, the topic about how it reflects the choreographer of how they should use the person.
Well, I'm not.
You were talking about your colleagues when they take a black dancer.
Well, a friend of mine, Keely Garfield, she made a quartet. A white British woman who lives and been working in New York for a long time. And she makes really interesting, quirky, kind of cool postmodern downtown New York work. She decided to make a quartet, and two of the dancers were white, two of the dancers were black. she and this other guy, and then the other black dancers were a male and a female. When she was doing costuming for them, she had costumes that she was thinking for her and her duet partner, and they were kind of frayed and a little bit, and then she just thought that, you know, they looked a little edgy and ragged and stuff. She put them on the two black bodies, and she was like, oh my God, if I put them in this, everybody's gonna think this is some reference to slavery. And that had not entered, and that was not part of the piece at all. I know Blondell Cummings had a piece called Chicken Soup, which is a gestural piece with her. There's films of it, and for her it was about the memory of being in the kitchen with her mom and her aunts. And one of the first times she performed the piece, a few people or somebody in the audience interpreted the piece as it being about her mother as a maid in a white household. And so how do you kind of take that out of the equation of people reading your contemporary postmodern blah, blah, blah work? What Blondell said, she did the simplest thing instead of just being angry and trying to scream about it every time, was she put a little liner note in the program that this piece was started or came from memories of her mom and her aunts in their kitchen. But it's just, it feels like it's an ongoing battle, whether I want to deal with it or not. It kind of keeps bringing its face up.
Can you say something to your dance? I like your dance very much, the spiritual journey, how you came to this dance, because what is a relationship to all this? I was fascinating how you go deep inside in yourself and could pray. It was a prayer. Could you speak, if you want to speak about your prayer experience when you had this projected consciousness in your journey?
In the solo?
Yes.
The
Yes.
solo that I did, Introduction, for me is fully, completely, and 200% a performance. It is not a transformative spiritual experience for me. I feel that it, over the years, is definitely has that effect on a lot of folks in the audiences in different ways. There are really specific things that I'm balancing compositionally, timing-wise. I've done the piece for a long time, but I'm also, with the research material from the Spiritual Baptist that I spent many, many, many years going to a lot of church services. In this thing, when they're what they call moaning, they come back after they've had visions and dreams and visions and dreams, and they're received from God or the Spirit what their role in the community is supposed to be, whether they're going to be a seer, a pointer, a diviner, a mother, a worker in the vineyard, whatever their title is, whatever their degree is. They have to come back in front of the congregation to prove that, okay, I had this vision. In this vision, I was walking down this road. I saw this woman in a yellow dress. The woman in the yellow dress told me, Haga Habib, Haga Habib, Haga Habib. People in the congregation know whether, if a woman in a yellow dress would teach you Haga Habib or Haga Habib, Haga Habib, Haga Habib. So that's not exactly the rhythm. But the audience and I started making these parallels in my own thinking that as an artist, I was going away traveling to these far-flung foreign places and coming back with information, and the audience that I was presenting the work to ended up being the provers or the judge of whether or not this was actually performance or not. So for me, this kind of parallel in a quote-unquote traditional setting and in a contemporary performance setting were very parallel. And that's often been the kind of conundrum or question in my head is, where is innovation? Where is something that's considered new or radical or an innovative idea, like talking while you dance or breathing while you dance in contemporary performance? That's something in this culture is actually something that's assumed or interacting with the audience. There are things that are assumed in a lot of traditional performative cultures that are radical in ours and vice versa. So those questions for me are always kind of coming up, and I'm trying to find different ways of presenting that information.
And I just quickly want to add, when I first saw Reggie in 2003, as a historian, what so drew me was this way that he worked as both an ethnographer, right, and as a choreographer, the way that Catherine Dunham had, and the way that Pearl Primus had, and the way that Zora Neale Hurston had, you know, all in the 30s and the 40s, you know, and similar questions, you know, when they then came back and sort of staged these, the results of their research, what we, you know, now all are talking about performance as research, right? Well, you know, these are also people who were doing performance as research, but in a very interesting way that I find kind of a fascinating way that Reggie's work is, to me, talking back to history.
Is there time for another question? Or?
Yeah, we got 10 more minutes, guys.
We have time.
We can get into it, yeah.
When I watched you before, your respiratory movement came from what I could see very much from the inside of the body and the spinal connection with the breathing. When I see the video, I see something very different. And I'd like you maybe to tell a little bit how, from what you were doing, which felt very convincing to me, not only convincing but very connected to some part of you that is real. I don't know how else to say it. I was very touched by it. And when I see this, I see contemporary dance, I see spines that are straight, I see peripheral gestural movements, and I miss, in a sense, what you had opened up. So maybe you can say something about that.
The first thing that comes to my mind is I have a lot of different pieces in my rep. Not every piece is dealing with the spiritual Baptist adoption. There are pieces that I've done that have dealt more with Zimbabwean gumboot dancing.
Social dancing.
Social dance forms.
Yeah.
So I feel like it goes from place to place.
Yeah.
And it can actually, for the more, I think, successful pieces, it could do that within the same piece. The breathing, I don't feel like it has anything to do with my spine. I feel like it has to do with breathing. For me, it is very much connected to observation and practice of, I feel like I've thought a lot about what is pedestrian movement in kind of a postmodern-y kind of way, and what is pedestrian in a lot of different African diasporic contexts. Mm-hmm. And the things that folks from different places, the way people will point, the way people will gesture, the way people will make eye contact or not make eye contact, the way that different body parts will be activated and become kind of neutral because of that activation. Those are the things that interest me, and some things are a lot more interesting or compelling to different audience members for different reasons. And I'm not overly concerned or obsessed about that, but it's been an ongoing, I feel like I deal with a lot of stuff and it appeals to different folks at different places.
Maybe just as an added remark, now knowing that you've worked with Ohad, whose work is very much connected to spinal movements, have you carried any of that over in your work?
That's for Ohad to know. I don't know. I mean, for me, I worked with Ohad pre-Gaga, and Ohad was doing Tai Chi and everything after his back injury and stuff. So there are things for me when I see the new work or the restaging of some of the old work, it doesn't have the weight that he used to really be screaming at us to have, but there's also a sense of how he's working. And for me, when I went back and got to work with him and understand what it was going on, it wasn't just about the spine. It was very much about the core. And I feel like my work and how I work is very much regardless of whether it's some material from Bharatanatyam or whether it's from gumboot dancing or whether it's from Sabar dance or whether it's ballet or jazz or whatever kind of thing. I feel like that's what I like to do, is pull from here to here. And the pelvis tends to be the strongest grounding place for the performers. And not 200% sure how it's reading or what you're looking at, but compared to the solo, maybe, I think compared to a lot of other work, the spine is really important for how the dancers orient themselves in my work.
But just to reiterate how in your teaching, in your rehearsal, that kind of grounded, that pelvis really underneath, that's something that's just really.
So even in our rehearsal process, folks bring in their different cultural practices, different cultural languages, training in ballet, training in a lot of different contemporary forms, and training in a lot of different folk and pop forms that we pull on and push out at different times. Yeah.
To me, Reggie is always working with what I would call found movement, and like some of this work, some of it comes from an Eskimo dance, which he observed when he had a teaching gig in Alaska. I mean, again, there are a lot of different sources. I think you see there feels like there's less mediation between the source movement and the performance in the solo, whereas, there's so much kind of complex work that goes on in the studio between some of the found movement sources and this. Maybe I think that's, clearly there's a difference there.
I don't know. I have a lot of imagination, so I just wonder.
It's, right now, there's some live vocalizations that we do that are pulled from some of the spiritual Baptists, also from some Khoisan Central African work, also from some Central African vocal work, as well as from some Arctic Inuit throat singing type things and Hausa throat singing type stuff. There's klezmer, pre-recorded music. There's some Zar from Egypt. There's old Southern gospel music. So we're trying to figure out and balance all of that, as well as singing on top of some of it, as well as some of it's us produced, so it's a lot of different.
And Reggie's always playing with different musics in rehearsal. He'll just put something on and then something else on and then something else on, and so just now sort of beginning to try to finalize,
what to actually
use in performance.
What to actually keep, and sometimes a recorded piece from blah, 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 we might actually just sing the rhythm of that, not using the actual words or using the actual structure.
And yet, of course, in performance, you're like, oh God, how could that have ever been not to that music, right? But it, was totally built not with that music, right? And then you just sort of, there's a play that goes on.
Susan, you said at the beginning that you were questioning what a actually both of you said you were finding out what a dramaturg was. I wonder if you've developed a methodology of dramaturgy through this practice.
All we can say is that we've developed a working relationship for the way that we work together best. And, this is our first, we only have our one case. But so we found that what worked was Reggie would pose the question, or have a big topic. I would find material. I would bring it back, present it to him. He'd select material. Again, so we would, then these interesting intersections would come out. So, we found what works for us, me just really as a scholar without any, as I said, training or even aspiration to take this role, though I have totally enjoyed every minute of it. Reggie getting to a point in his career where he thought, well, maybe it would be helpful to have somebody help me organize all this information that I bring into the studio, and then he, presents to his dancers and works through, and some more documentation that is out there on Reggie. So that's how we've found to work.
And for me, it was really like just kind of expanding, or kind of what I call, Susan, a scholar on steroids. It's like I have like maybe 5 sources or books
Yeah.
that I think that I'm interested in, Susan will actually go through all of the footnotes and all of the
Yeah.
citations and kind of really pick through what else might be out there that's in the track of what I'm going, and then it's just like, okay, that's it, that's more.
Yeah.
And then some of the things that are just too dense for me to maybe read through, she actually will kind of read through it and
Summarize,
shrink it down. And there's also been this kind of having somebody, another smart person in the room, as Forsyth said yesterday, that's there from the beginning to the end and helping me sort through the information. And we didn't talk about maybe you did mention the website, the kind of closed website of information. So all of these sources, instead of me just keep bringing them into rehearsal, we've been able to put them on a platform so the performers, as well as once we start bringing a costume designer and lighting designer, that they've actually been able to go back to all of this stuff that's not just in my head and then me kind of condensing down. It's still my condensing down, but then it's like, okay, here's the actual section
On Zora,
of Zora and
right?
why Zora. And then Susan, for each kind of research cluster that I was interested in, and then we had these sources, she wrote memos to kind of orient the collaborators to each set of information. So it's the organizing and then the documenting before, during, and after, and you're also going to be writing some articles to be published. So it feels three-dimensional, and I feel like it also feels organic in that Susan was a fan of my work, I was a fan of her work, of her scholarship, and we were both influencing, I think, each other's work, so it seemed like it just made sense to make this a real working relationship. Does that help?
You made it very clear in your conversation about the baggage that other people bring, and I feel like the first comment really brought a lot of baggage onto an artist because he's a contemporary artist of color, that you assumed that he was meant to be doing something African. That's the way it came off. Yeah. I think we should just all be in check.
I just want to respond to that and just respond to something Reggie said earlier. And again, I just think this is, just so important, for me in terms of the work I do and looking back at history and looking now, all responses are totally legitimate. Questioning our responses, being able to sort of go, why is somebody assuming that or not that? This is really, really important work to think through reception. And I know I was one of the people yesterday that was like, oh my God, there's this non-see, and then there, right? But again, I mean, it's, like I say, to me, this is really important cultural work that Reggie is doing, is bringing this work to us to be able to ask these questions. That's what Reggie's work does, and yeah, okay, that's what Reggie's work does. Yeah.
For sure.
That's what Reggie's work does. Woo, Reggie!
Yay, Susan.
It's okay.